Today we want to learn how to save items in a database on Android. It's not going to be a lesson about SQL or databases, but basically how we're going to do it on Android. So what do we need? We need a database object, and we need a way to interact with that database object to save items, right? So we need an item object as well. We'll need a item service, and the service will allow us to fetch items, and it will also allow us to save items. So that's pretty basic right there. We'll go through setting up each. We'll start with the item object and define what our items are going to look like. We just need something generic. And then we'll define our database and talk about what we need to do to create the database, connect to it, and put objects inside of it. Let's get started. I'm going to create a new basic activity. We're going to call it item tracker, right? Because we want to save items in the database, and we want to track our items basically. Here we have Android Studio. I've created a new project. We've got our main activity. We've got our project package right here. It's holding our classes. And here we have onCreate, which creates the screen that you see. Well, it launches your main activity. Our first screen that you see actually is a fragment that's launched by the fragment intent. But we'll just take a look by clicking play, and we've selected our Pixel 5 API. Our Pixel 5 virtual machine, virtual device. Here you can see it running. There's our first fragment. All right, so you can see here's the code to launch the first fragment. And if we look under our resources and values, strings, we see our first fragment string, which correlates to this right here. And we say this is our item tracker. And we'll say hello item tracker. Rerun it, we should see that updated. Now we see item tracker and hello item tracker. All right, we're not going to get into wiring up too much in here. We are basically just going to concentrate on the functionality of the database. We don't want to get bogged down to details. This is meant to be straightforward and simple, just to help us connect to a data. So first, let's create our item. So I'm going to create a new package called domain, because our item is a domain specific model. I'll call it item. One thing you need normally in a SQL database, it's helpful to have an ID to keep track of your item. We're going to have a string that is the item name, and we're going to have an expiration date. That is a calendar expiration date. I use this same structure on the other project that I did day before yesterday. And let's have a price for the item. All right, so instead of typing all this code, let's go ahead and generate our constructor. We'll do a no-arg constructor, and then we will click code and click generate, or press alt insert, and we'll generate an all-arg constructor. Alt insert will generate our getters and setters to access our private fields. And then bottom, we'll generate a toString method. So here's all the boilerplate code for an item. It's practicing encapsulation. We've got private fields and accessors and mutators and toString method and a constructor. So that's all we need to do to create our item, right? So now if we wanted to, we could go to our main class, and while the main class is loading, we could say fruit. Now let's say specifically Pokemon card is a new item, and its ID we won't set. We'll let the database set that. We'll say that its name is Charizard, I think that's how you spell it. And let's see, what's our order here? Expiration date is tomorrow. And the price is $1.99. All right, we need to come up with that tomorrow variable. So we'll say calendar. Tomorrow is equal to calendar.getInstance. That'll give us an instance of a calendar. And then we'll just add a day to that calendar because getInstance gives us a calendar for now. If we add based on the calendar date field, 1 day, it'll give us 24 hours from now. So tomorrow. So we've got an item, right? But that's all we've got is an item. I mean, we could print it, which said system.out.println, and we just said item Pokemon card. If I can spell. We're inferring toString. You can call toString, but it's inferred by default because it tries to cast whatever you put here as a string. We left it like that. We could use our item in the form that it's in. If we rerun our application and we look at the output, we can see that in our output, we should have our item somewhere. And here you can see that we have our item, Charizard, and then a bunch of fields for the calendar object, but all of our data is there basically. Kill these other apps so we don't get confused. Okay, so now we want this item to be saved. We want to be able to add multiple items in theory, right? So we're not really going to go into creating the form that would allow us to add items. But say our second fragment was that form. We would go to our second fragment. We would change it just a little bit. And let's create some plain text fields. We'll do the name. And then we'll do the price. Let's see. No, we need a number field for that. Price. Yeah, let's make it bigger. We need the price. And then we need a date picker, date. The expiration. So this is going to be simple. And then we'll add another button. Button ID, declared attributes, text, let's save item. And then on this button, let's say that it go to item list. All right. So let's take that. Let's make this a string as well. And we named it save item. So let's go back to our resources, add another string, save item. There we go. So we internationalize our strings in the proper way, and we should be good. Okay, so the name, and then our price, and our expiration date. So input type, ID, item name. Item price, item expiration. We're hitting refactor, so it updates all the fields accordingly. So this is our item. Oops. Make that. Try this again. Text view. Text a little bit larger. All right, this is our text view. Let's just say that this is our item name. And then this is our item price. Is our item expiration. Go to our strings and we will say string and it's item name. String, it's item price. String, item expiration. This allows you to translate your application to other languages very easily without having to change the code of your application. All right, so there we go. So now if we run our application, we should see all this nice fancy stuff. Bravo. This probably has to do with this button being set up like that. And rerun it. Let's add a linear layout that looks a little nicer. All right, that should line up all of our items in order. Saying that an item isn't found. Let's go add a button. Button. It's going to be previous, and the button is going to be, I think, called a button second. Is that what they called it? Yeah, button second. All right, fix that. I haven't done layouts in a long time, so let's try that. There we go. Okay, so it's not pretty, but we could say that we have a Pokemon card, and this price is $349,000, and its expiration date is summer of never. So save item should save it. Going to item list. Okay, so save item. We need to make that functionality for save item. All right. So how do we do that? How do we save an item in the database? So first we need to create a database. So let's create a new package that is specific to the database. Let's call it database. Let's create a new class that's called database, right? So what do we need here? Well, Android has a class called SQLite Open Helper. We need to extend that class, and I hit Alt Enter on that red line. It says implement methods. We want to add those methods on create and on upgrade. This says on create, what do we do? And on upgrade, what do we do? So right now we're just going to leave it the way it is. We need to add a constructor. Depending on what version of the SDK you're using, you're going to want to be careful about which constructor you implement. We're using Lollipop, so we're going to go with the first one, which requires a context, a database name, a cursor factory, and a version. So that's perfect. That's the basis for creating our database right now. So let's create another package, service package, and let's create a class called the item service. And in the item service, we need that database. So let's create a private field that is a database. Let's create a constructor. And into that constructor, let's pass in the app context, right? Because we need the app context to create the database. Alt enter or command enter to import that. So we say this.database is equal to a new database, which is our class, and we know what we're passing in, right? We're passing in the app context, we're passing in the database name, passing in a cursor factory, which we'll just send as null, and we're passing in the database version. So now we've created the database and made it available to our item service class. We need to name our database. So let's alt enter on that or command enter and create constant field database name. And it's a string, and we'll name it item database. We need to do the same for version. So we'll alt enter, command enter, we'll create an integer version 1. It's version 1 of our database. So now our item service is initialized and we can do something with it. So what's the first thing we want to do? We want to be able to save an item. So let's do this. Let's create public long save item, and we'll pass in an item to save. The reason we return long, alt enter to import the item. The reason we return long is we want to return the item of the ID we've created, just like the database does. All right, so to create this, we need an actual SQLite database, which we'll call DB, and we'll get that from our database class. So we'll get a readable we'll get a writable database because we're writing to the database with new data. So we basically just call insert on the database. So the insert call is going to return an ID. So we can just return that from our call, unless you wanted to manipulate it here, which we're not going to. So we'll just say return db.insert, and it's asking for some things. So we're going to say that we want to start with the table name, null column hack, and content values. So item content values. All right, we need to create these values. We're going to do that in a second. Another method that you want in a database class would be a get all method. So we want to get a list of items, basically. So get all items. Now this doesn't make sense in larger enterprise applications, but in a small application, it might make sense to get everything from the database. So let's do that. To do that, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create an SQLite database. We just need a readable database at this point in time. And then we're going to grab a cursor from the database. That cursor allows you to manipulate the results that you get back from the database. So we're going to say db query, and we're going to pass in the table name again. And we're going to pass in our columns again. And we're going to pass in our selection, which is null. And we're going to pass in our selection arguments, which are null, and our group by, which is null, and our having, which is null, and our order by, which is null, and our limit, which is null. Need to import the cursor class. Now let's handle the cursor that comes back, which is going to have your items in it, right? So let's create a list to hold the items. It's called items. It's an array list. And let's iterate over the cursor. So while cursor.move to next, there's our cursor pointing at the next item. So let's create an item from this. So we'll say new item. We can do this all inline, but I'm not going to. We'll say set ID. And that's the first ID that we get. So we'll say cursor.getInteger, and it's the first field, which is 0. And we'll say item.setName. We'll get a string from the cursor, and that's the first column. We'll say item.setPrice. That's cursor.getDouble. And then we'll say item.setExpiration-date, which is a calendar object. So we'll have to create one of those. So we'll set it to the expiration date of the object. Now to do that, we need to convert our string into the expiration date. So let's do this. Let's say get item expiration date. And let's pass in cursor.getString 3, which would be the expiration date column. So let's go ahead and Alt Enter or Command Enter on that. Create method. Yes, it's going to return a calendar object, and it's going to take the expiration date as a string. So let's create a calendar.get instance. That's now. Now we've got a string value that is our calendar. So there's a few ways to do this. The fastest way would be to do it from a date and the string value, and then to set the calendar to the date.time in milliseconds. Get time, that's it, time in milliseconds. Set time in milliseconds to the, and then return that calendar, which is the expiration date. Let's change that, refactor, rename to expiration date. So let's see. The only thing to make sure of when we're doing this is that when we save the object, we're saving it properly, and we'll take care of that when we get the content values for the item. So let's take a break from doing this. So we've got the service laid down with most of the things that we need, right? We can get the items and we can save the items. Let's go and create this stuff right here. So we're going to go back to our database package, and we're going to create a new package underneath that called contract. Now these aren't necessarily real contracts. This is just to keep track of your database schema. One way to keep track of your database schema. There's lots of different ways to do it. This is just one way. So we're going to call it the item contract. Create a private constructor because we don't want people instantiating this class, right? Did not mean to import that. So private constructor, and then we're going to create an inner class for this item specifically called item entry, and it's going to implement base columns. And so we're basically just going to put the data into constants here. So there's a string that is the table name, and it's item table, right? And we'll go on for each column. So you can see I've named the columns, column name, etc. And then I put them all into an array called columns. So we've got everything we need for the definition of our schema right here. So now we go back here and we say item entry.table name. We can use that item table name and make sure we don't get it wrong. Now here we have item content values. So let's create a way to grab those values in a way that we can manipulate what goes into the database. So let's say on the item we passed in, get content values. And we'll create that method on the item, which is a little bit iffy when you talk about good practice, but I'm okay with it in this case for mobile development. So we'll create a content values object called content values, or called values. And then we'll just add this item to this value. So we'll do values.put, and we'll start with the name, right? So the first one is the item name. So we need that column name, item entry, column name, and then the value would be this.getName, right? Same values.put, item entry dot price, right? So let's do price. This dot get price, and then the last one. Last, we'll put in the expiration date, values dot put, and we need a specific string to match the way we converted back from a string using the date time. So let's do that. So item expiration date, and we'll get the expiration date, but we'll get time, which will return a date object, right? And we'll do that as a toString. There we go. So that should put it in there, right? And then we'll return the values back to the caller. So now if we go back here, our insert statement is complete. We have the table name and we have the content values. Now here on the get, we do the same thing, item entry, table name, and the columns, we've already created an array of them called columns. So there we go. So that's all done now. After we create our item, we obviously need to add it to the array and then return it. All right. So the item service is pretty much done. We have to go back to our database though, because we didn't do anything with our database yet, right? All right, so we need to define the create SQL for our tables. So let's put that into an array, right? So let's create a static string array, and let's call it SQL create entries. And that's an array, right? No, that's an array. So now we put our strings in here, we can create tables in each of the strings. So we're just going to create one table for right now. So we'll say create table space. Then we have the table name, right? Item entry table name. Opening parentheses, obviously. Remember to add spaces. Let's put this on the same line. And then our first column, item entry dot ID plus space, and then this is going to be our primary key, integer, perfect, integer primary key auto increment, meaning it'll automatically increment the key, put a comma at the end, plus another item entry column, which is the name column, which is just a text value with a comma at the end of it. And the next one is the price, which is a numeric value. So here we'll call it a double. And then the last thing is the expiration date, which is text again. So close our parenthesis. There is our string to create that table. So now we need to execute all of those. So we'll iterate over those strings. So creation SQL. And we'll pass in the SQL create entities and we'll iterate over it. And for each one, we'll say SQLiteDatabase execute SQL, and we'll just pass in that creation SQL. We'll do the same thing, so we can just copy and paste basically for the on upgrade. This will drop our tables, right? So instead of SQL create entities, we're going to have SQL delete entities. So let's Alt Enter on that, create constant field. There we go, it created it for us. Put that there. And basically all we need to do is do the reverse, which is drop table if exists. And we have our table name, right? Item entry table name. That's all there is to it. So now we can create and delete our database. So let's test this. We can write a test, or we can wire up our button. Let's go to our second activity. Let's go to our second fragment. Okay, let's get the values from the form we created. We have an edit text for the name. And that's an edit text, and it's find view by dr.id.item name. We named that earlier when we created the text box in our layout. Edit text, the price text is the same thing. Cast it to an edit text object. View.find view by dr.id.price. So we've got our two fields. Now what we need to do is create an item from that. So we'll say a new item. And we'll set the expiration date on all items created to tomorrow, right? So we'll say, again, calendar tomorrow is equal to calendar.getInstance, and tomorrow is calendar plus, a date of 1. So our item.name, so it started with expiration date, is tomorrow. And then our item.name is the name text.getText.toString. Our item.price is, we have to parse it double. So from the price text.getText.toString, we get a string, and then we'll parse it to double. So we have our item. So now we need to call the item service, and we need to say save this item, which gives us back an ID. And then we need to navigate to the home page automatically, I guess, unless you just wanted to rely on the button. We could do either way. So we need an item service. So let's create an item service, private item service, and let's create it on create. Let's say item service is equal to new item service, and pass in this for the context. Let's start get context. So save item. There we go. So that should save our item and return us to the home screen. But now how do we see it on the home screen? So let's go back to our home screen, which I believe is here. And if you look, we've got hello item tracker, right? So let's add text view right below it. Let's add a text view right below it. Make it a little bit bigger. And let's change some of the values for this. Let's say its ID is item count. And it has no text. All right, so we added constraints to it. Let's clean up this mess we made right here. Now let's go back to our second fragment, and let's say that before it navigates, let's create a toast. I've got a toast here I created. So you normally might want to do this asynchronously. You have items in your database. So we'll post a message showing how many items are saved, and we should be good to go. So let's try it on out. So let's create an item named magic card. The price is $3,902. Let's save it. We have 1 items in our database. Let's do it again. Let's do a Pokemon card this time. And its price is $9,322. Hey, look, we have 2. We are saving our items in our database. That is the basics. We could show everything that's in there. First activity on create. We'll get the multi-line text view. Name it. iterate over the items by calling get all items. Let's create a service here as well. On create, we'll create an item service is equal to new item service, and we'll pass in this.get context. And we'll import the item class, and then we'll say item text.append, and we'll say new line item.name. Item.getName. So it crashed. Null pointer, first fragment, 33. Unable to find. Industrial activity, error inflating, binary XML, line 8. Line 8. All right, let's just do a scroll view. All right, so we've got a text view with text equal to item placeholder. And an ID of what? ID of item list. First. No, let's call item list. So item list. Let's grab it. Let's append the text to it. See if that works. All right, we'll create the item service, and then once the view is created, we'll say view find view by ID, because obviously we can't do it before the view is created because that would be crazy. And there's our items. So keep adding items. There's another bug that we've uncovered. That's good. Let's fix this one as well. It says it doesn't like this. So what we're going to do is if we don't enter a price value, we're going to ignore this by catching any exception that comes from the parsing. And we're just going to set the price to 0. So that should fix that problem. One more thing, actually, it would be also helpful to see the price of our item. So after we add the item name, we'll add a dash, and then we will add the price. Let's say space dash space $sign plus item.getPrice. You should probably put a currency format around there, but we're just going to leave it like it is for now because this video is already way too long. And there we go. I don't know if I can do it without the currency formatter though. That work? Beautiful. And take our $sign out. Let's rerun it. Yep. Now we have a fully functioning inventory tracking application, right? So we say an item is a desktop computer, and we don't put a price in there. Should work anyway. It's 0. It does. You see our toast is still working. Now we say MacBook Pro, and it costs $4,999. Beautiful. So what we've learned, database is basically just implementing the SQL Open Helper and creating your database. As you can see, if I close the application and relaunch it, that's the wrong application. If I close the application and relaunch it, my database persists. The SQLite stores it as a file on your drive, so it's not going anywhere. You can change the version number. You could clean it up. You could use it per user. There's lots of things you could do here, but I'm going to call this one done and dusted. So we've got our item service, get all items, save items using that database class that we built. And here you can see that we clearly built a view that shows everything that's going on. And this is a scroll view as well. You can see when we laid it out, we created a scroll view. So if you were to keep adding, it would eventually scroll. Well, I hope you liked the video. I'm going to do some more. And my last one was pretty popular as far as my videos go. So I'm excited to see how it goes. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to at least give me a like for the hours and hours I put into this video.